When Flight 447 lost both engines at 31,000 feet over the Atlantic, every pilot in the industry said the same thing: impossible landing. The aircraft was too heavy, the approach too steep, the margin for error non-existent. But sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs. This is the story of how a forgotten backup pilot proved that experience isn't measured in flight hours, and that the most important landings happen when there's no second chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Sarah Hendricks stepped off the shuttle bus at Meridian Airways' flagship training facility in Phoenix, Arizona, her weathered flight bag slung over one shoulder and a battered headset case in her free hand. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete tarmac, but it was nothing compared to the heat she felt from the stares of her fellow pilot candidates. The Meridian Advanced Pilot Certification Program was legendary in aviation circles. Only the elite made it through the 6-month intensive training that would qualify them to captain the airline's newest fleet of ultra-modern aircraft. Sarah looked around at her competition and immediately understood she didn't belong. To her left, Marcus Thompson was explaining the features of his brand new Bose Aviation headset to an admiring group. Fresh out of the Air Force with over 3,000 hours in fighter jets, he moved with the confident swagger of someone who'd never questioned his place in a cockpit. His flight suit was crisp, his shoes polished to mirror finish, and his logbook thick, with entries from the world's most advanced aircraft. "Check out this new synthetic vision system," Marcus was saying, holding up a tablet displaying cutting-edge cockpit technology. "I've been beta testing it for 6 months. Makes flying these commercial birds feel like playing a video game." Sarah glanced down at her own equipment. Her headset was a David Clark model that had seen better decades, held together with electrical tape and prayers. Her flight bag bore the scars of countless regional flights in aircraft that most of these candidates had probably never even heard of. While they compared the latest aviation apps and glass cockpit displays, Sarah quietly pulled out a worn paper notepad and began sketching wind patterns she'd observed during the approach to Phoenix Sky Harbor. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Rebecca Chun, a polished young pilot whose resume read like an aviation fairy tale. Harvard graduate, former airline executive turned pilot, and daughter of a legendary airline captain. "Are you here for the cargo pilot orientation?" "I think that's in the other building." The question stung, but Sarah had learned long ago not to show it. "Actually, I'm here for the Advanced Pilot Certification Program." Rebecca's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly. She glanced at Sarah's worn equipment and faded uniform shirt, then at the clipboard in her own hands. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see your name on the priority candidate list. Did you come through the military fast-track program?" "Regional Airlines," Sarah replied simply. 15 years with Mountain West Express. The silence that followed was telling. Mountain West Express was exactly the kind of small, unglamorous airline that served remote destinations with aging aircraft and minimal technology. It was where careers went to quietly fade away, not where future captains of cutting-edge jets were forged. 15 years, Rebecca repeated, as if trying to process how someone could spend that long in what she clearly considered aviation's minor leagues. Wow, a lot of experience with older aircraft, I bet." Marcus had overheard the conversation and wandered over, his entourage following. "Wait, you're telling me someone from a puddle jumper airline made it into this program? How does that even happen?" Sarah pulled her acceptance letter from her bag, the paper slightly creased from being handled so many times. She'd read it dozens of times since receiving it 3 months ago, still hardly believing it was real. "Emergency landing evaluations," she said quietly. "Apparently my scores in crisis management simulations were unusual." "Unusual how?" Asked Jennifer Walsh, another candidate whose father owned a private aviation company and who'd been flying jets since she was barely old enough to see over the instrument panel. Sarah hesitated. The truth was that her simulation scores hadn't just been high, they'd been unprecedented. While other pilots relied on automated systems and computer assistance, Sarah had consistently performed manual landings in impossible conditions that left instructors shaking their heads in disbelief. But explaining that would sound like boasting, and she'd learned that actions spoke louder than words. Just did well on the tests, I guess. Marcus laughed, not unkindly but with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never failed at anything aviation-related. Well, this should be interesting. I've never seen someone try to transition from flying antiques to modern jets. Hope you're ready for a steep learning curve. Before Sarah could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the morning air. Chief Training. Captain Daniel Rodriguez stood at the entrance to the main training facility, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. Behind him, the sleek glass building rose like a monument to modern aviation, its walls lined with displays of the latest aircraft technology. "Welcome to Meridian Airways Advanced Pilot Certification," Rodriguez announced as the candidates gathered around him. "You are here because you represent the future of commercial aviation. Over the next 6 months, you will learn to operate the most sophisticated aircraft in our fleet, master cutting-edge navigation and safety systems, and prove that you have what it takes to be entrusted with the lives of hundreds of passengers." Rodriguez's eyes scanned the group, lingering briefly on Sarah before moving on. "I want to be clear about something from the start. This program has a 30% pass rate. Most of you will not make it through. Those who do will join an elite group of aviators qualified to captain our newest aircraft on the most challenging routes in the world." He gestured toward the building behind him. "Inside, you'll find flight simulators that cost more than most people's houses, training aircraft equipped with technology that didn't exist 5 years ago, and instructors who've flown everything from experimental jets to space shuttle approaches. If you think your previous experience has prepared you for this, think again." The group began filing into the building, and Sarah found herself swept along with the crowd. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior, walls lined with massive flight simulators, computer stations with multiple screens displaying real-time weather data from around the world, and aircraft cutaway sections that allowed students to study every component of modern avionics systems. "Impressive, right?" Marcus said, appearing beside Sarah as they walked through the main corridor. "This is what real aviation looks like. Not like those little prop planes you're used to." Sarah nodded politely, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. Through a window, she could see the training aircraft parked on the tarmac. Sleek, modern jets with glass cockpits and fly-by-wire controls. But she was also studying the wind patterns around the aircraft, noting how the heat shimmers from the pavement affected visibility, observing the way dust and debris moved across the surface. While her fellow candidates admired the technology, Sarah was reading the environment. They were led to a briefing room where Rodriguez began the formal orientation. Charts and graphs covered the walls showing accident statistics, performance metrics, and the technological evolution of commercial aviation. Sarah pulled out her worn notepad and began taking notes by hand while everyone else used tablets and laptops. "The modern commercial pilot," Rodriguez was saying, "is part technician, part computer operator, and part decision maker. The days of flying by the seat of your pants are over. Today's aircraft are so sophisticated that they can practically fly themselves. Your job is to manage systems, monitor computers, and intervene only when absolutely necessary." A hand shot up from the front row. It was Rebecca Chen. "Captain Rodriguez, what about manual flying skills? Don't we still need to know how to hand fly an aircraft?" Rodriguez smiled. "An excellent question. Yes, basic manual skills are still required, But the reality is that modern aircraft are designed to be flown by automation. The computer is faster, more precise, and more reliable than any human pilot. Your training will focus on system management and decision-making within the framework of automated flight operations. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. In her 15 years with Mountain West Express, she'd hand-flown aircraft through mountain passes, ice storms, and mechanical failures that would have overwhelmed any computer system. She'd landed on remote strips where GPS was unreliable and weather reports were hours old. But apparently, none of that mattered in this world of glass cockpits and automated systems. As the briefing continued, Sarah began to understand the philosophy behind the program. Speed was everything. Rapid decision-making, quick system diagnostics, fast adoption of new technology. Pilots were expected to process information quickly, trust their instruments completely, and execute decisions with computer-like efficiency. During the break, Jennifer Walsh approached Sarah with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "I have to ask, what's it like flying those old regional aircraft? I mean, I've only ever flown modern jets with full glass cockpits and autopilot systems." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "It's different. You develop a feel for the aircraft that goes beyond what the instruments tell you. You learn to read weather patterns, wind shifts, terrain effects. When you can't rely on computers for everything, you have to trust your instincts." Jennifer nodded politely, but Sarah could see the dismissive look in her eyes. Instincts were exactly what this program was designed to eliminate. Modern aviation was about precision, predictability, and technological superiority. There was no room for gut feelings and seat-of-the-pants flying. The afternoon brought their first simulator evaluation. As they lined up outside the training bays, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Each candidate was assigned to a different type of simulator based on their background and experience level. Marcus and the other military pilots were directed to the most advanced units, perfect replicas of the newest aircraft with full motion capability and incredibly realistic visuals. Sarah found herself assigned to a basic trainer, the kind used for initial certification rather than advanced training. The message was clear. Despite being accepted into the program, she was being treated as a remedial student who needed to catch up to the real candidates. The simulator instructor, a middle-aged pilot named Captain Thompson, greeted her with professional courtesy but little enthusiasm. "Let's see what we're working with," he said, settling into the instructor's seat. "I understand you're coming from regional aircraft. This is going to be quite a transition." As Sarah strapped herself into the simulator, she felt the familiar weight of low expectations settling around her. The cockpit was indeed unlike anything she'd flown before. Glass displays instead of traditional instruments, fly-by-wire controls instead of direct mechanical linkages, automated systems that managed everything from engine parameters to navigation. "The key to flying modern aircraft," Thompson explained, "is learning to trust the automation. The computer knows more about the aircraft's performance envelope than any pilot ever could. Your job is to monitor and manage, not to actually fly." The evaluation began with basic maneuvers: takeoff, climb, cruise, and approach procedures. Sarah found herself constantly fighting the unfamiliar systems, trying to hand-fly an aircraft designed to be managed rather than piloted. Every input felt delayed, filtered through computers that interpreted her intentions and executed them according to their own logic. When she tried to make a small correction for wind during the approach, the system resisted, maintaining its programmed descent path. When she attempted to adjust power manually, the auto-throttle system overrode her inputs. It was like trying to drive a car where someone else controlled the steering wheel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're fighting the aircraft," Thompson observed. "Let the systems do their job. Your inputs should be minimal and deliberate. Think of yourself as a supervisor, not a pilot. The words stung, but Sarah tried to adapt. She reduced her control. Inputs allowed the automation to manage the flight path and focused on monitoring the displays. The aircraft flew smoothly and precisely, but she felt disconnected from the process, like a passenger in her own cockpit. As the session concluded, Thompson made notes on his evaluation form. Sarah couldn't see what he was writing, but his expression suggested it wasn't entirely positive. "You'll need to work on your systems integration," he said finally. "Your manual flying instincts are actually working against you here. The sooner you can unlearn those old habits, the better you'll perform." Walking back to the main building, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation from the other candidates, comparing their simulation experiences. Marcus was describing a complex emergency scenario he'd handled flawlessly. Rebecca was discussing advanced navigation procedures she'd mastered. Jennifer was explaining how quickly she'd adapted to the new flight management systems. Sarah said nothing about her own evaluation, but she could feel the gap widening between herself and the other candidates. They were embracing the new technology, integrating seamlessly with automated systems, and impressing their instructors with rapid adaptation and system mastery. That evening, as she arranged her belongings in the small apartment provided for program participants, Sarah pulled out her logbook and began reviewing her entries from the past 15 years. Page after page of flights in difficult conditions, emergency landings, and challenging approaches that had required every ounce of skill and instinct she possessed. Through her window, she could see the other candidates gathered at a nearby restaurant, their laughter carrying across the parking lot. They were bonding over shared experiences and similar backgrounds, building the network of relationships that would serve them throughout their careers. Sarah had been invited, but she could sense that her presence would only highlight how different she was from the rest of the group. Instead, she opened her worn notepad and began sketching approach patterns for the local airport, noting wind patterns and terrain features that might affect aircraft performance. It was an old habit from her regional airline days, when knowing every detail of an airport's unique characteristics could mean the difference between a safe landing and a smoking crater. Tomorrow would bring more training, more evaluations, and more opportunities to prove that she belonged in this program. But as Sarah looked at her reflection in the window, a middle-aged woman with weather-beaten hands and eyes that had seen too many close calls, she wondered if she was fighting a battle she'd already lost. The other candidates had youth, connections, and backgrounds that perfectly matched what Meridian Airways was looking for in their future captains. Sarah had only her experience, her instincts, and a stubborn refusal to accept that 15 years of hard-won knowledge was suddenly worthless. She had no way of knowing that in just a few months, those dismissed instincts would be the only thing standing between 180 passengers and certain death, and that the aircraft everyone said was impossible to land would require exactly the kind of flying that computers couldn't do and automation couldn't teach. But first, she had to survive being the misfit in a world that had already decided she didn't belong. The second week of training brought the formal introduction to Meridian's revolutionary training philosophy, and with it, Sarah's first real understanding of just how far behind she truly was. The morning briefing took place in the state-of-the-art auditorium, where Chief Training Captain Rodriguez stood before a massive display showing real-time data from commercial flights around the world. "Welcome to the future of aviation," Rodriguez announced, gesturing to streams of information flowing across the screen. "What you're seeing is live telemetry from our entire fleet. Every aircraft, every flight parameter, every decision made by every pilot, monitored and analyzed in real time by our operations center." Sarah watched in fascination as the display showed dozens of aircraft icons moving across a world map, each accompanied by detailed data about altitude, speed, fuel consumption, and system status. It was impressive, but also slightly unsettling. In her regional airline days, once you left the ground, you were largely on your own until you checked in with the next air traffic control center. This is what we call integrated flight management, Rodriguez continued. Our pilots don't just fly aircraft anymore. They operate within a comprehensive network that optimizes every aspect of flight operations. Weather routing, fuel efficiency, schedule coordination, maintenance planning, it's all connected, all automated, all optimized for maximum safety and efficiency. Marcus Thompson raised his hand. Sir, how does this affect our decision-making authority as pilot in command? Rodriguez smiled approvingly. Excellent question, Thompson. The beauty of the system is that it enhances your decision-making by providing you with more information than any pilot in history has ever had access to. The computer doesn't make decisions for you. It gives you perfect information so you can make perfect decisions. From her seat in the back, Sarah scribbled notes in her paper pad. She'd spent 15 years making decisions with imperfect information. Outdated weather reports, unreliable equipment, and constantly changing conditions. The idea of perfect information seemed almost too good to be true. Now, Rodriguez continued, let's talk about your evaluation criteria. The Meridian Advanced Pilot Certification Program uses a comprehensive scoring system that measures 5 key competencies. The display changed to show a detailed rubric with weighted categories. Sarah leaned forward to study the breakdown. System. Integration proficiency 30%. How quickly and effectively pilots could master automated systems, flight management computers, and integrated avionics. Decision speed under information load 25%. The ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously and make rapid decisions based on computer-provided analysis. Technology. Adoption rate 20%. How readily pilots embrace new systems, software updates, and evolving procedures. Standardization. Compliance 15%. Adherence to exact procedures and protocols with minimal deviation or improvisation. Collaborative. Network integration 10%. Working effectively within the broader operational network, including dispatch, maintenance, and air traffic management. Sarah studied the categories with growing unease. Missing entirely was any mention of manual flying skills, weather interpretation, mechanical troubleshooting, or the kind of situational awareness that came from years of hands-on experience. According to this rubric, everything she'd spent 15 years developing was either irrelevant or actively discouraged. After the briefing, the candidates were divided into small groups for their first major evaluation, the Integrated Systems Challenge. Each team would manage a simulated cross-country flight using the full range of modern, automated systems while dealing with various operational scenarios. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Delta, along with 3 other candidates who seemed less than thrilled with the arrangement. Rebecca Chun was clearly the team leader by virtue of her MBA and previous airline management experience. Kevin Foster, a young pilot fresh from a prestigious university aviation program, had already demonstrated remarkable aptitude with computer systems. Lisa Martinez, daughter of a Meridian Airways captain, brought insider knowledge of company procedures and politics. And then there was Sarah, whose presence seemed to puzzle her teammates. So, Rebecca said as they gathered around their assigned workstation, let's figure out our strategy. The scenario involves a flight from Phoenix to Boston with multiple weather systems, air traffic delays, and some mechanical issues. We need to optimize for on-time performance, fuel efficiency, and passenger comfort while maintaining safety margins. Kevin pulled up the flight planning software on his tablet. I can handle the performance calculations and routing optimization. The system can run thousands of scenarios in seconds and find the perfect solution. Lisa nodded. I'll manage passenger service coordination and gate scheduling. Dad taught me all the tricks for working with operations control. Rebecca looked at Sarah expectantly. What's your strength area? Where do you want to focus? Sarah hesitated. In her old world, she would have been studying weather patterns, calculating fuel requirements manually, and planning alternate airports based on her knowledge of regional conditions. But those skills didn't seem to fit anywhere in this team. Structure, I could handle ... monitoring? She offered uncertainly. Keep an eye on the overall situation while you work on the specific systems. Rebecca's smile was polite, but clearly disappointed. Sure, that works. Think of yourself as our quality control person. The simulation began with their aircraft departing Phoenix on schedule. Kevin's routing optimization was flawless, finding the most efficient path through complex airspace while avoiding weather. Lisa coordinated seamlessly with simulated ground services, ensuring smooth passenger connections and service logistics. Rebecca managed high-level decision-making, balancing competing priorities with corporate efficiency. Sarah watched the displays showing their virtual flight progress, but something felt wrong. The computer-generated weather data showed a relatively benign system along their route, but when she pulled up satellite imagery on a secondary screen, she noticed cloud formations that didn't match the forecast models. "Hey," she said quietly, "I think there might be an issue with the weather data. These satellite images show convective activity that's not in the system." Kevin glanced over briefly. The weather routing algorithm accounts for all available data. Sources. If there was a problem, it would have flagged it. Sarah studied the images more carefully. In her experience, computer models were excellent for broad predictions, but often missed localized phenomena. The cloud formations she was seeing suggested the possibility of severe turbulence or even microbursts, dangerous wind conditions that could affect aircraft performance dramatically. "I really think we should consider an alternate route," she pressed. "These cloud patterns look unstable." Rebecca checked her watch, noting that they were making excellent time on their current routing. "Sarah, the system has processed data from weather radar, satellite feeds, pilot reports, and meteorological models. It's flagged with no significant issues. We need to trust technology." 15 minutes later, their simulated aircraft hit severe turbulence that the computer hadn't predicted. Passengers were injured, service was disrupted, and their on-time performance was destroyed as they were forced to deviate around weather that the system insisted wasn't there. "What happened?" Lisa asked, studying the post-incident analysis. The weather system showed clear conditions. Sarah pulled up her earlier satellite observations. The computer models missed convective development. "You can see it starting to form here about an hour before we entered that airspace." Kevin frowned at his screens, but the algorithm should have caught that. It's designed to process that exact type of data. Designed by people who've never flown through a thunderstorm. Sarah muttered, then immediately regretted speaking up. The comment drew stares from her teammates. Rebecca's expression was particularly cold. "Are you suggesting that experienced aviation professionals don't know how to design weather systems?" "No, I just meant that sometimes you need to look beyond what the computer tells you. Experience can lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making," Rebecca interrupted. "That's exactly why these systems were developed, to eliminate human error and subjective judgment." The remainder of their simulation was tense and uncomfortable. When they encountered a mechanical issue, a hydraulic pressure warning, Sarah suggested some troubleshooting steps based on her experience with similar problems. Her teammates ignored her input, following the computer-generated diagnostic procedures that ultimately identified the wrong component and led to unnecessary delays. When their session ended, Team Delta ranked 7th out of 8 groups. Their weather deviation, mechanical troubleshooting failure, and overall inefficiency had resulted in a comprehensive failure across all evaluation criteria. During the debrief, Captain Rodriguez reviewed each team's performance with clinical precision. When he reached Team Delta, his critique was particularly sharp. This team demonstrated several concerning trends, he said, consulting his digital notes. Poor integration with automated systems, resistance to standardized procedures, and decision-making based on intuition rather than data analysis. Sarah felt her cheeks burn as Rodriguez continued. In particular, there was an incident where team members questioned weather routing algorithms based on, what was the phrase used? Experience with similar conditions. This kind of thinking represents exactly the outdated mindset we're trying to eliminate. After the debrief, Sarah's teammates made their feelings clear. Kevin approached her first, his usual politeness strained. Look, Sarah, I know you're trying to help, but questioning the systems in front of everyone makes our whole team look incompetent. Lisa was more direct. My dad says the old-school pilots always think they know better than the computers. But that attitude doesn't fly anymore. Literally. Rebecca's feedback was the most cutting. Sarah, I need you to understand something. This isn't about disrespecting your experience, but that experience was gained in a completely different era of aviation. What worked in small regional aircraft with basic instruments doesn't apply to modern commercial operations. That evening, Sarah received an email from Captain Rodriguez requesting a private meeting. She knocked on his office door the next morning with a growing sense of dread. Sit down, Hendricks, Rodriguez said without looking up from his computer screen. We need to discuss your performance and attitude. Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. Your simulation scores are concerning, Rodriguez continued, finally meeting her eyes. More concerning is the feedback I'm receiving about your interactions with other candidates. There are reports of you questioning established procedures, undermining team decisions, and promoting outdated flying techniques. Sir, you were trying to apply 15-year-old methods to 21st century aviation. Rodriguez interrupted. I want to be very clear about something, Hendricks. You're here because your emergency landing scores were exceptional. But exceptional performance in crisis situations doesn't mean you understand modern operational procedures. He pulled up her file on his screen. Your background is regional aviation, correct? Small aircraft, basic systems, minimal automation? Yes, sir, but I've also dealt with challenging conditions that have no relevance to commercial airline operations, Rodriguez finished. Hendricks, I'm going to be frank with you. Your acceptance into this program was not unusual. Your test scores indicated potential, but your actual performance suggests those scores may have been anomalous. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Sir, what are you saying? I'm saying that unless you can demonstrate significant improvement in systems integration and team collaboration, we'll need to consider whether this program is the right fit for you. Rodriguez handed her a thick manual titled Automated Systems Integration, Best Practices for Modern Commercial Pilots. Study this, master it, and most importantly, stop fighting the technology that's designed to make you a better pilot. Your next evaluation is in 1 week. Consider it a last chance to prove you belong here. Walking back to her apartment that evening, Sarah passed the restaurant where her fellow candidates gathered each night. Through the window, she could see Rebecca animatedly describing something to an attentive audience, probably their simulation experience. Marcus was showing something on his tablet while Jennifer and Kevin leaned in to get a better look. Sarah kept walking, Rodriguez's words echoing in her mind. Everything she'd learned, every skill she'd developed, every hard-won piece of knowledge from 15 years of flying was apparently not just irrelevant, but actively harmful to her prospects as a modern commercial pilot. In her apartment, she opened the manual Rodriguez had given her and began reading about integrated flight management, systems, automated decision-making protocols, and the philosophy of technology-dependent aviation operations. The message was clear: trust the computer, follow the procedures, and never second-guess the system. But as she read, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of those satellite images showing weather that the computer had missed. or the hydraulic problem, that her experience had correctly diagnosed while the automated systems had failed. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, the system wasn't as perfect as everyone believed. She had no way of knowing that this voice would soon become the difference between life and death for 180 passengers, or that her outdated instincts would prove to be the only thing capable of solving a crisis that would leave every computer system helpless. But first, she had to survive another week of being told that everything she knew was wrong. The memorandum arrived at 600 hours on a gray Thursday morning, slipped under Sarah's apartment door while she was reviewing approach charts for the day's training session. The official Meridian Airways letterhead bore news that shouldn't have surprised her, but still hit like a physical blow. Effective immediately, pilot candidate Sarah Hendricks is reassigned to the Flight Operations Support Division pending further evaluation of program compatibility. Report to Director of Flight Safety Amanda Walsh at 0800 hours. Sarah stared at the paper, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. She wasn't being dismissed entirely, not yet, but she was being removed from the main training track and relegated to what amounted to administrative support. The backup's backup, as she would later learn to call herself. An hour later, she found herself standing outside an unmarked office in the basement level of the training facility, a part of the building she'd never seen before. The corridors here were utilitarian, lacking the sleek glass and polished steel of the main training areas. This was where the unglamorous work of aviation happened, far from the spotlight of cutting-edge pilot development. Amanda Walsh answered Sarah's knock with a gruff, "Come in," that carried the weight of someone who dealt with too many disappointments. The office was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets, computer terminals, and stacks of incident reports that reached toward the ceiling like paper monuments to aviation's imperfections. Walsh herself was in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen enough close calls to make her perpetually wary. Her desk nameplate read Director of Flight Safety, but her surroundings suggested someone who operated far outside the mainstream of Meridian's corporate culture. "So you're the washout from upstairs," Walsh said without preamble, gesturing for Sarah to sit in a worn chair that had seen better decades. "Rodriguez says you can't play well with others and keep questioning the almighty computer systems." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I wouldn't characterize it that way. I was trying to contribute my experience to—" "Save it," Walsh interrupted, but not unkindly. "I've heard this story before. Experienced pilot with real-world knowledge gets steamrolled by the technology crowd. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Sarah could answer, Walsh pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the desk between them. "This is your new assignment, Flight Safety Analysis. You're going to help me investigate incidents, analyze pilot performance data, and review safety protocols. It's not glamorous, and it sure as hell isn't what you came here for, but it might teach you something the pretty boys upstairs never will." Sarah opened the folder to find a collection of incident reports, each one detailing flights where things had gone wrong despite all the advanced technology and automated systems that were supposed to prevent problems. Equipment failures, weather encounters, passenger emergencies, a catalog of moments when real pilots had to make real decisions without the luxury of perfect information or computer assistance. "Your first task," Walsh continued, "is to analyze these incidents and identify patterns. I want to know what went right, what went wrong, and most importantly, what lessons we're not learning because we're too busy trusting machines to think for us." The work was immediately fascinating in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Each incident report was like a puzzle, requiring her to piece together the sequence of events that led from routine flight to emergency situation. More importantly, she began to see patterns that the official analyses had missed. Flight 892 from Denver to Seattle had encountered severe turbulence that damaged the cabin and injured 14 passengers. The official report blamed unexpected weather conditions and noted that the automated weather avoidance system had functioned normally. But Sarah noticed something else. The pilot's report mentioned visual cues, cloud formations, and atmospheric conditions that had been ignored because they contradicted the computer-generated weather data. Flight 1445 from Miami to Chicago had been forced to make an emergency landing in Atlanta after experiencing multiple system failures. The incident was officially attributed to cascading equipment malfunctions, but Sarah's analysis revealed that the failures had followed a pattern that an experienced mechanic might have recognized and prevented through manual intervention. Again and again, Sarah found examples of situations where human experience and intuition had been overruled by automated systems, sometimes with dangerous results. She began compiling a database of these incidents, cross-referencing them with pilot backgrounds, aircraft types, and weather conditions. Finding anything interesting? Walsh asked one afternoon, appearing behind Sarah's shoulder as she worked through another stack of reports. More than I expected, Sarah replied, pointing to her computer screen where she'd created a matrix showing correlation patterns. Look at this, incidents involving experienced pilots who questioned automated systems versus those involving newer pilots who followed procedures exactly. Walsh studied the data with growing interest. What am I looking at? The experienced pilots had better outcomes, even when they deviated from standard procedures. They caught problems earlier, made better decisions under pressure, and recovered from emergencies more effectively. But according to official evaluations, they're being marked down for not following protocols. And the newer pilots? Sarah pulled up another screen. Textbook procedure compliance, perfect integration with automated systems, excellent evaluation scores. But when things went sideways, they struggled. They waited for computers to provide solutions instead of taking immediate action. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, studying the patterns Sarah had identified. How long have you been working on this analysis? 3 weeks, but I think I'm just scratching the surface. There's a systematic bias in how we evaluate pilot performance that's actually making flights less safe, not more. Show me. For the next hour, Sarah walked Walsh through her findings. She demonstrated how pilots who questioned automated systems were consistently rated lower in evaluations, even when their skepticism led to better outcomes. She showed how emphasis on procedure compliance was creating pilots who couldn't adapt when procedures failed. Most damaging of all, she revealed how the pursuit of efficiency and standardization was eliminating exactly the kind of thinking that prevented accidents. Jesus, Walsh muttered when Sarah finished her presentation. Do you realize what you're suggesting? That our entire training philosophy is backwards? Not backwards, Sarah corrected. Incomplete. We're training pilots to be system operators instead of aviators. When the systems work perfectly, that's fine. But when they don't? Walsh stood and walked to her window, which looked out on the main training facility where Sarah's former classmates were probably mastering another automated procedure. Sarah, I need to ask you something. Are you willing to go deeper with this research? Because if you're right, and I think you might be, this is bigger than just training protocols. What do you mean? I mean, this could affect how we certify pilots, how we design aircraft systems, how we respond to emergencies. But investigating it properly would require access to classified incident data, pilot psychological evaluations, and performance records that go way beyond what you've seen so far. Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, I want to understand this completely. Walsh nodded and pulled out a security form. Then you're about to get a clearance upgrade and access to information that will probably keep you awake at night. But first, I need to know, are you doing this because you're angry about being dropped from the program, or because you genuinely believe there's a safety issue? It was a fair question, and Sarah took time to consider her answer honestly. Both, she said finally. I am angry. I spent 15 years developing skills that I thought mattered, and I've been told they're not just irrelevant, but harmful. But more than that, I'm scared. If we're graduating pilots who can't think for themselves when computers fail, we're setting up for disasters. Walsh signed the security form and handed it to Sarah. Welcome to the real aviation safety business. Your new clearance will give you access to restricted incident databases, classified performance studies, and pilot evaluation records dating back 20 years. What you're going to find will probably confirm your worst fears. Over the following weeks, Sarah dove deeper into the hidden world of aviation safety data. The classified reports painted a disturbing picture of an industry increasingly dependent on automation, populated by pilots who excelled in training but struggled in real-world emergencies. The most troubling discovery came from a Pentagon study of military pilots transitioning to commercial aviation. Pilots with extensive combat experience, those who'd learned to fly in situations where computers failed and automation was unreliable, consistently outperformed academy graduates in unexpected emergency scenarios. But they also consistently scored lower on standardized evaluations and struggled to advance in airlines that prioritized procedure compliance over adaptive thinking. Sarah began creating what she privately called the Real Pilot Database, a comprehensive analysis of pilot performance that went far beyond official metrics. She tracked not just how pilots performed in training, but how they handled actual emergencies, how they adapted to unexpected situations, and how they made decisions when standard procedures didn't apply. The patterns were undeniable. The best pilots, those who saved lives and prevented accidents, were often the ones who scored lowest on modern evaluation systems. They questioned computers, deviated from procedures when necessary, and relied on experience and intuition when data was incomplete or unreliable. "You've been working late every night for 2 weeks," Walsh observed one evening, finding Sarah still at her computer long after normal hours. "What are you finding?" Sarah gestured to her screen, which displayed a complex chart showing correlations between pilot backgrounds, training scores, and real-world performance. "I'm finding that we're systematically identifying and eliminating the pilots we need most. Look at this data from the past 5 years." The chart showed a clear trend. As airlines had moved toward automation-focused training, the number of incidents involving pilot error had remained constant, but the nature of those errors had changed. Instead of mistakes caused by overconfidence or recklessness, accidents were increasingly caused by over-reliance on automated systems and inability to respond when those systems failed. "It's like we're creating pilots who are perfect in normal conditions but helpless in abnormal ones," Sarah continued. "And aviation isn't about normal conditions. It's about what happens when everything goes wrong." Walsh studied the data with the expression of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. "Sarah, this research, if you're right, it has implications for every major airline in the country, maybe the world." "I know, and there's something else." Sarah pulled up another screen showing geographical patterns and incident data. "The problems are getting worse, not better. As automation becomes more sophisticated, pilots are becoming more dependent on it. We're creating a generation of aviators who literally don't know how to fly when the computers stop working." It was then that Walsh told Sarah something that would change everything. "There's someone you need to meet. Someone who's been fighting this battle longer than either of us, but from the inside. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, head of emergency response training." "Morrison? I've heard that name." "You should have. She's a legend. Flew everything from bush planes to space shuttle approaches before moving into commercial aviation. She's also the person who designed the emergency landing evaluations that got you into this program in the first place." Walsh picked up her phone and dialed an internal extension. "Liz? It's Amanda. I've got someone down here you need to meet." The pilot from the certification program who's been doing that safety analysis we discussed. Yes, the washout. Trust me, you'll want to see what she's found. 20 minutes later, Captain Elizabeth Morrison walked into Walsh's office, and Sarah immediately understood why the woman was legendary. Morrison moved with the confident precision of someone who'd faced every kind of emergency aviation could offer and emerged stronger each time. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp, and her presence filled the small office with an energy that suggested great things were about to happen. "So you're the candidate who keeps questioning the computers," Morrison said, settling into a chair with the ease of someone comfortable anywhere. "Amanda tells me you've been digging into incident data and finding disturbing patterns." "Yes, ma'am. I think we have a serious problem with how we're training pilots." Morrison smiled. "Show me." For the next 2 hours, Sarah presented her findings to someone who finally understood their implications. Morrison asked probing questions, challenged assumptions, and pushed Sarah to think beyond the data to the real-world consequences of what she'd discovered. "Impressive work," Morrison said when Sarah finished. "You've independently confirmed what I've been trying to prove for 3 years. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" "Ma'am." "Sarah, your research doesn't just suggest there's a problem. It documents a crisis that's going to get people killed if we don't act. But changing an entire industry's approach to pilot training requires more than data. It requires proof. That can't be ignored." Morrison stood and walked to the window. "I'm developing a new emergency response training program, one that emphasizes adaptive thinking and manual flying skills alongside automated systems. But to get approval, I need to demonstrate that alternative approaches actually produce better pilots." She turned back to Sarah. "I want you to help me design that program. Use your research to identify the specific skills and knowledge that separate good pilots from great ones. Then help me figure out how to teach those skills to a new generation of aviators." Sarah felt her heart race. After weeks of exile and dismissal, someone was not only listening to her ideas but asking her to help implement them. "Yes, ma'am. I'd be honored." "Good, because in about 3 months, we're going to get a chance to prove that old-school flying skills still matter. And when that opportunity comes, we need to be ready." Morrison gathered her materials and headed for the door. "Oh, and Sarah? Keep doing that safety analysis. But from now on, you're not just documenting the problem, you're building the solution." As Sarah watched Morrison leave, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Meridian: hope. Her exile from the main training program had led her to discoveries that could reshape aviation safety. Her dismissal from elite pilot training had positioned her to help design something better. She had no way of knowing that Morrison's opportunity to prove old-school flying skills still matter would come much sooner than expected, or that Sarah's research would provide the knowledge needed to save lives when every automated system failed and only human skill could prevent disaster. But first, she had work to do in the basement, building the foundation for a revolution in Koshu. Aviation training that would begin with a single impossible landing. Sarah's breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in her 3rd month of safety analysis work. She'd been cross-referencing pilot performance data with aircraft maintenance records when a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. She immediately called Amanda Walsh, despite the ungodly hour. "This better be good, Hendricks," Walsh answered. "Gradually, Amanda, I need you to see this immediately. I think I found something that explains why we're having so many near-miss incidents." 40 minutes later, Walsh arrived at the office to find Sarah surrounded by printouts, computer screens, and charts that covered every available surface. Coffee cups and energy drink cans suggested she'd been working through the night again. "Show me," Walsh said, settling in with her own cup of coffee. Sarah pulled up a complex database query on her main screen. I've been analyzing the correlation between pilot training scores and subsequent performance in actual emergency situations. But then I started looking at something else. The aircraft these pilots are flying and how those aircraft have been modified over the past 5 years. She clicked through several screens showing technical specifications. Look at this. Meridian has been systematically upgrading their fleet with more advanced automation systems. Newer flight management computers, enhanced autopilot capabilities, more sophisticated warning systems, all designed to reduce pilot workload and improve safety. Sounds reasonable so far. It would be, except for this. Sarah pulled up another screen showing incident data. Emergency situations are actually increasing, not decreasing. And they're happening disproportionately on aircraft with the newest automation systems. Walsh leaned forward, studying the data more carefully. What kind of emergencies? That's the disturbing part. They're not mechanical failures or weather-related incidents. They're situations where pilots become confused by conflicting information from automated systems, or where they're unable to diagnose problems because the computers are giving them false readings. Sarah clicked to a specific case study. Flight 634, Phoenix to Dallas last month. Brand new aircraft, top-rated pilot, perfect weather conditions. The plane started giving warning messages about engine problems that didn't actually exist. The automated systems insisted there was a fire in the left engine and initiated emergency shutdown procedures. I remember that incident. Turned out to be a sensor malfunction, right? Right, but here's what the official report doesn't mention. Sarah pulled up the pilot's confidential interview transcript. Captain Richards knew the warnings were false. He could feel that the engine was running normally, the temperatures were stable, and there were no actual signs of fire. But the computer was so insistent and the warning system so aggressive that he second-guessed his own experience. Walsh read through the transcript with growing concern. He says here that he was trained to trust the automated systems over his own senses. Exactly. And that training nearly caused a disaster. If he had shut down a perfectly good engine over the ocean, they would have been flying on one engine with a full passenger load. The margins for error become very small in that situation. Sarah pulled up a map showing similar incidents across the country. Red dots marked locations where pilots had been misled by automated systems, creating dangerous situations that human judgment could have prevented. It gets worse, Sarah continued. I've identified 17 incidents in the past 6 months where experienced pilots correctly identified system malfunctions, but were overruled by automated procedures or air traffic control relying on computer data. Overruled how? Company policy requires pilots to follow automated system recommendations unless they can prove the systems are wrong. But proving a computer is malfunctioning often requires the kind of technical knowledge and diagnostic time that pilots don't have in emergency situations. Walsh stood and began pacing. A habit Sarah had learned indicated serious concern. What you're describing sounds like we're training pilots to be passengers in their own aircraft. That's not the worst part. Sarah pulled up her most disturbing finding. I've been tracking the career progression of pilots who've questioned automated systems or deviated from computer-recommended procedures. They're being systematically weeded out of the industry. The screen showed employment records for dozens of pilots who'd made decisions based on experience rather than automation. The pattern was clear: poor evaluation scores, limited advancement opportunities, and in many cases, eventual resignation or termination. We're creating a selection pressure that favors pilots who follow computers blindly and eliminates those who think independently, Sarah explained. In 20 years, we're going to have an entire generation of commercial pilots who literally don't know how to fly without computer assistance. Walsh stopped pacing and stared at the data. Sarah, if this analysis is correct, it's not just a training problem. It's an industry-wide crisis waiting to happen. What does Elizabeth Morrison think about this? That's why I called you. I need to present this to her, but I also think we need to go higher. This affects every airline, every aircraft manufacturer, and every regulatory agency. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Before we brief Morrison, I want you to document one more thing. I need you to identify specific examples where old-school pilot skills saved flights that automation would have crashed. Over the next week, Sarah dove into historical flight data with renewed purpose. What she found was a treasure trove of incidents where experienced pilots had saved lives by ignoring or overriding automated systems. The most dramatic case was Captain Janet Sullivan's landing of Flight 892 at Denver International Airport 3 years earlier. The aircraft had suffered multiple hydraulic failures that left the automated flight control systems completely inoperative. According to computer models, the aircraft was unflyable and should have crashed, but Sullivan, a former agricultural pilot with thousands of hours of manual flying experience, had used differential engine thrust and manual trim adjustments to maintain control. She'd landed the aircraft safely using techniques that weren't taught in modern training programs and weren't even documented in the aircraft's flight manual. The official report credited exceptional pilot skill for the successful outcome. Sarah told Walsh as they reviewed the case, but it doesn't mention that Sullivan was criticized by her airline for not following emergency procedures. She was actually disciplined for deviating from checklist protocols. Sarah had found 12 similar cases where pilots with unconventional backgrounds, crop dusters, bush pilots, military aviators, and regional airline veterans had saved aircraft through manual flying skills that the next generation of commercial pilots were never being taught. It's like we're throwing away a century of aviation knowledge because it doesn't fit our computer models, Sarah observed. The day of her presentation to Captain Morrison arrived with unexpected drama. As Sarah was preparing her materials in the conference room, Marcus Thompson appeared in the doorway. Her former classmate looked uncomfortable and slightly embarrassed. "Hey, Sarah," he said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I heard you were working down here on some kind of safety analysis. That's right. How's the advanced training going?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. We had an incident last week during a simulation that ... Well, it made me think about some of the things you said during our team exercises." Sarah gestured for him to sit down. "What happened?" "We were doing an advanced emergency scenario. Multiple system failures during approach to landing. The kind of situation where the computers are giving conflicting information and you have to make quick decisions." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, clearly troubled by the memory. "The whole team just froze. We kept waiting for the automated systems to give us clear guidance, but they couldn't process the multiple failures. We crashed the simulator 3 times before the instructor ended the session." "What did the instructor say?" "That's the weird part. He said the scenario was based on a real incident from 5 years ago where the actual pilots saved the aircraft. But when we asked how they did it, he said they used non-standard techniques that aren't part of our curriculum." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "Did he mention the pilot's name?" "Yeah, Captain somebody, Sullivan, Janet Sullivan, I think." It was the same case Sarah had been researching. She pulled out the incident file and showed Marcus the technical details of Sullivan's emergency landing. "This is what she did," Sarah explained, walking through Sullivan's improvised control techniques. "She essentially flew the aircraft manually, using methods that required understanding the physical principles of flight, not just the computer interfaces." Marcus studied the diagrams with growing amazement. "We were never taught any of this. I wouldn't even know where to begin with manual trim control or differential thrust steering." "That's exactly the problem I've been researching. We're graduating pilots who are completely dependent on automated systems, but those systems aren't infallible." Before Marcus could respond, Captain Morrison entered the conference room with Amanda Walsh. Morrison's expression was serious, and she carried a thick folder that suggested this meeting would cover more than just Sarah's latest findings. "Hendricks," Morrison said without preamble, "I need to know how quickly you can complete your analysis of automation dependency in pilot training." "Ma'am, I think I already have most of what you need. But why the urgency?" Morrison exchanged a glance with Walsh before answering. "Because we just received word that the Federal Aviation Administration is launching a comprehensive review of pilot training standards. They want data on automation effectiveness, pilot performance metrics, and safety outcomes." She opened her folder and spread out several official documents. This review could reshape how every pilot in the country is trained and evaluated. If your research is as significant as Amanda suggests, it needs to be part of the official record. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Her months of exile and investigation had led to discoveries that could influence aviation policy at the highest levels. "I'm ready to present my findings, but there's something else. I think the problems I've identified are about to get much worse." "Explain." Sarah pulled up her latest analysis on the conference room's display screen. "I've been tracking the rollout of next-generation automation systems across the industry. Within 2 years, most commercial aircraft will have AI-assisted flight management. That makes current automation look primitive." The screen showed aircraft modification schedules for major airlines. "These new systems will be even more sophisticated, more insistent, and more difficult to override. If pilots are already struggling to maintain manual flying skills with current technology, what happens when they're flying aircraft that essentially pilot themselves?" Morrison studied the data with the expression of someone watching a slow-motion catastrophe. "You're saying we're about to make the dependency problem exponentially worse?" "Yes, ma'am. And I think we have maybe 2 years to change course before we create a generation of pilots who are essentially passengers in their own cockpits." Marcus, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Ma'am, if I may. What Sarah is describing matches exactly what we're experiencing in advanced training. The better we get at managing automated systems, the worse we get at actually flying." Morrison turned her attention to Marcus with sharp interest. "You're one of the current certification candidates?" "Yes, ma'am. Top of my class in systems integration and automation management. But last week's emergency simulation showed me that I don't actually know how to fly an aircraft when the computers fail." "And how do you feel about that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer honestly. "Terrified, ma'am. If I can't handle a simulation, what happens when I'm responsible for real passengers in a real emergency?" Morrison nodded grimly. "That, Candidate Thompson, is exactly the right question. And it's why we need to change everything about how we train pilots before someone gets killed." She turned back to Sarah. "Hendricks, I'm accelerating your timeline. I need your complete analysis ready for presentation to the FAA Review Board in 2 weeks. This is our chance to prove that the industry is heading in the wrong direction before it's too late to change course." As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her research was no longer an academic exercise or a way to understand her own failures. It was evidence that could reshape aviation training for decades to come. Walking back to her basement office, she passed the main training facility where her former classmates were, probably mastering another automated procedure. Soon, those same classmates might be flying passengers in aircraft they couldn't manually control if the computers failed. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd been deemed too old-fashioned for modern aviation training was now tasked with saving that same training from its own technological obsessions. She had 2 weeks to compile evidence that could prevent a future catastrophe. What she didn't know was that the catastrophe would come much sooner than anyone expected. and that her research would provide the only roadmap for survival when every automated system failed and only human skill remained. The emergency began. At 31,000 feet over the North Atlantic, exactly 3 days before Sarah's scheduled presentation to the FAA Review Board. Flight 447, a Meridian Airways transcontinental service from Boston to London, carried 180 passengers and represented everything the airline prided itself on: cutting-edge technology, highly trained crew, and the most advanced automated flight management systems in commercial aviation. Captain David Chun, Rebecca's older brother and one of Meridian's youngest pilots to achieve command status, was monitoring the aircraft's progress from the cockpit when the first indication of trouble appeared on his displays. It started as a simple warning message about ice crystal formation in the engine sensors, routine enough that the automated systems were designed to handle it without pilot intervention. First Officer Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Amanda, despite sharing a surname, was reviewing fuel calculations when her displays suddenly filled with conflicting information. Engine temperature readings fluctuated wildly, airspeed indicators showed impossible values, and the aircraft's flight management computer began issuing contradictory commands. "Dave, I'm seeing some weird readings here," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that marked graduates of Meridian's advanced training program. "The automation is recommending we reduce power, but the backup instruments are showing normal operation." Captain Chun glanced at his own displays, which showed a cascade of amber and red warning messages appearing and disappearing in random patterns. His training kicked in immediately. Trust the automated systems, follow established procedures, and allow the computers to guide decision-making. "Let's run the checklist for unreliable airspeed," Chun said, pulling up the appropriate electronic procedure on his tablet. "The automation will handle power management while we diagnose the sensor issues." But the automation wasn't handling anything. Unknown to the crew, their aircraft was experiencing a phenomenon that aerospace engineers had theorized about but never seen in practice: a cascading failure of interconnected systems that created a feedback loop of false readings and automated corrections. The ice crystals that had triggered the initial warning had indeed affected the aircraft sensors, but not in the way the computers anticipated. Instead of simple temperature variations, the crystals had created electromagnetic interference that confused multiple systems simultaneously. The flight management computer, trying to reconcile contradictory data from dozens of sensors, began making increasingly erratic decisions. 200 miles away, Sarah Hendricks was in the Meridian Operations Center, putting the finishing touches on her FAA presentation when the first distress call came through. She'd been invited to observe the center's operations as part of her research into how ground support handled in-flight emergencies. "Meridian Operations, this is Flight 447, came Captain Chun's voice over the radio, still calm but with an undertone of concern. "We're experiencing multiple system anomalies and requesting guidance for troubleshooting procedures." The operations controller, trained in the same automation-dependent philosophy as the pilots, immediately began pulling up computer-generated diagnostic protocols. "Flight 447, we show normal parameters on all your systems from our monitoring station. Are you certain you're experiencing actual malfunctions?" Sarah looked up from her laptop, recognizing something in the pilot's voice that the controller had missed. She'd heard that same tone hundreds of times during her regional airline career, the sound of an experienced aviator who knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it to the computers. "Operations, we have conflicting readings on airspeed, engine parameters, and flight control status," Chun continued. "The automated systems are making power adjustments that don't match our visual observations of engine performance." The controller consulted his computer screens, which continued to show normal flight parameters. "Flight 447, our automated monitoring shows all systems within normal limits." Recommend you continue following automated guidance and run standard diagnostic procedures. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the scenario she'd been warning about in her research. Experienced pilots identifying problems that automated systems couldn't detect, only to be overruled by ground support relying on the same flawed computer data. She approached the operations supervisor, a veteran named Tom Rodriguez who'd been managing flight operations since before Sarah's career began. "Tom, I think there's something wrong with that flight that your computers aren't picking up." Rodriguez glanced at his displays. "All our monitoring equipment shows normal operation. The pilot's probably just dealing with minor sensor glitches that the automation will correct." What if automation is part of the problem? Before Rodriguez could respond, Flight 447's voice returned, this time with unmistakable urgency. "Meridian operations, we're now showing complete failure of our primary flight management system. Backup systems are giving contradictory information. And automated power control is no longer responding to crew inputs." The operations center suddenly became very busy. Controllers began pulling up emergency checklists, while technicians tried to establish data links with the aircrafts on board. Computers. But every attempt to diagnose the problem remotely returned the same result. All systems normal. "It's like the aircraft is lying to us," Rodriguez muttered, staring at displays that insisted everything was fine while the crew reported cascading failures. Sarah moved closer to the radio console. "Tom, can I make a suggestion?" "I'm listening." "Stop trusting your computers and start listening to your pilot. He's telling you there's a problem that your automated systems can't detect or understand." Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear the increasing tension in Captain Chun's voice as he worked through emergency procedures that weren't designed for his situation. The automated checklists assumed that computer diagnoses were accurate, but when the computers themselves were providing false information, the procedures became useless or even dangerous. "Flight 447, Meridian operations," Rodriguez transmitted. "We're having difficulty confirming your reported malfunctions from our monitoring station. Can you provide more specific information about what you're observing?" "Operations. We're hand-flying the aircraft now because the automation started making control inputs that didn't match our flight path," Chun reported. "Engine indications are erratic, but the engines sound and feel normal. It's like all our sensors are giving us false information simultaneously." Sarah grabbed Rodriguez's arm. "That's exactly what my research predicted. The aircraft is experiencing sensor contamination that's confusing the automated systems. The more the computers try to correct for problems that don't exist, the more problems they create." "You're saying automation is causing the emergency?" "I'm saying the automation is preventing them from solving it. Every time they try to diagnose the real problem, the computers insist everything is normal and override their corrections." On the radio, Flight 447's situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Operations, we've lost reliable instrumentation for airspeed, altitude, and engine performance. The aircraft is still flying, but we're essentially blind to our actual flight parameters." Sarah realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the exact scenario she'd been warning about for months. An aircraft with systems so sophisticated they couldn't recognize their own failure, flown by pilots trained to trust automation over their own experience, supported by ground controllers relying on the same compromised computer data. "Tom," she said urgently, "you need to patch me through to that aircraft." "Sarah, you're not qualified to provide operational guidance to." "I'm the only person in this room who understands what's happening to them," Sarah interrupted. "Those pilots are trying to fly a modern aircraft using techniques they were never taught, while computers actively fight every decision they make. If someone doesn't help them soon, they're going to crash." Rodriguez hesitated for only a moment before handing her the radio microphone. "Flight 447, this is Meridian operations. I'm putting you in contact with our senior flight safety analyst, who may have insights into your situation. Sarah took the microphone with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Flight 447. This is Sarah Hendricks in operations. I need you to describe exactly what happened when your problem started. Captain Chun's voice came through clearly. Sarah, we first noticed ice crystal warnings from the engine sensors. Standard stuff that the automation usually handles automatically. But then the system started making corrections for problems that didn't seem to exist. Captain, I believe your aircraft is experiencing cascading automation failure caused by sensor contamination. The computers are trying to fix problems there, creating themselves. You need to disconnect all automated systems and fly the aircraft manually. Sarah, we're at flight level 310 over the Atlantic. Manual flying at this altitude and distance from land isn't exactly standard procedure. It's about to become your only option, Sarah replied. The automated systems are giving you false information and making dangerous corrections. Every minute you leave them connected, they're going to create more problems. Through the radio, Sarah could hear Chun consulting with his first officer and reviewing their options. She knew they were facing an impossible decision: trust their training and continue, relying on automation that was clearly malfunctioning, or disconnect systems they'd been taught never to override and attempt manual flight techniques most modern pilots had never practiced. Operations, Chun finally transmitted. We're going to attempt manual disconnect of all automated flight management systems. But we're going to need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and constant guidance for manual approach procedures. Rodriguez looked at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and terror. You just convinced a commercial airline captain to shut off every safety system on his aircraft and hand fly over the Atlantic Ocean. I convinced him to stop letting malfunctioning computers fly his aircraft for him, Sarah corrected. Now we need to help him land safely using skills that modern training barely teaches. She turned back to the radio. Flight 447, once you disconnect the automation, you're going to need to rely on basic flying techniques and manual calculation of your flight parameters. I'm going to walk you through procedures that most commercial pilots haven't used in years. Sarah, Chun's voice carried both gratitude and apprehension. I hope you know what you're doing, because we're about to find out if old-school flying skills still work in a 21st century aircraft. As Sarah began coordinating with air traffic control to clear airspace and identify emergency landing sites, she realized that everything she'd researched and warned about was happening in real time. The aviation industry's dependence on automation had created exactly the scenario her data had predicted: sophisticated systems failing in ways their designers never anticipated, flown by pilots who'd never learned to function without computer assistance. Flight 447 had become a flying laboratory for testing whether human skill could overcome technological failure. The lives of 180 passengers now depended on Sarah's ability to guide pilots through procedures that weren't in any modern manual, using techniques that the industry had largely abandoned in favor of automated precision. Through her earpiece, she could hear Captain Chun and First Officer Walsh working to regain control of their aircraft as systems that had been helping them now actively fought their efforts to fly safely. Every decision they made had to overcome not just the emergency itself, but also computers programmed to prevent exactly the kind of manual intervention that might save their lives. Operations, Chun transmitted after several tense minutes. We've disconnected primary automation and established manual control. But our instrumentation is still unreliable, and we're going to need constant guidance for navigation and approach procedures. Sarah looked at the operations center's displays, knowing that the ground-based computers were just as confused as the aircraft systems. The technological infrastructure that supported modern aviation was designed around the assumption that automated systems were more reliable than human judgment. Now, With 180 lives hanging in the balance, that assumption was about to be tested. In the most dramatic way possible. Sarah's months of research and analysis had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of responsibility she felt as Flight 447's only link to survival, the backup's backup, was about to become the primary source of hope for a landing that everyone had said was impossible. Flight 447, I need you to ignore everything your instruments are telling you and fly by feel. Sarah's voice cut through the static as Captain Chun struggled to maintain control of an aircraft that seemed determined to fight his every input. The computers are lying to you, but the aircraft itself is still honest. In the operations center, every controller and supervisor had gathered around Sarah's station. The woman they'd barely noticed working in the basement had become the focal point of the most dramatic emergency in Meridian Airways history. Tom Rodriguez stood behind her, his face pale as he realized that conventional emergency procedures were useless in this situation. Sarah, Chun's voice crackled through the radio, strain evident despite his professional composure. When you say fly by feel, what exactly do you mean? I've got 180 passengers back here, and seat of the pants flying isn't exactly what they teach in modern certification programs. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, drawing on 15 years of experience flying aircraft where computers couldn't save you. Captain, forget everything you learned about trusting your instruments. Focus on what the aircraft is telling you through the controls. How does the stick feel? What do you hear from the engines? What does your body tell you about the aircraft's attitude? Through the operations center speakers, everyone could hear the subtle background noise of Flight 447's cockpit, the hum of engines, the whisper of air over the fuselage, the quiet clicks and beeps of systems still trying to function normally, despite the chaos in their electronic brains. The engines sound normal, Chun reported, strong and steady. The aircraft feels stable, but every gauge is telling me we're either stalling or overspeeding, depending on which display I look at. Trust what you feel, not what you see, Sarah responded firmly. Your inner ear and your hands on the controls are more reliable than any computer right now. What's your gut instinct about your airspeed? There was a pause before Chun answered. It feels like we're flying normally. Maybe a little fast, but within safe parameters. Then you probably are. The sensors are contaminated, but the aircraft itself is fine. You're going to navigate to an emergency landing using techniques that pilots used for decades before computers existed. Sarah turned to Rodriguez. I need you to contact Gander International in Newfoundland. Clear all traffic and prepare them for an emergency landing with unreliable instruments. Gander? That's over 400 miles from their last known position. It's also the largest runway available with the best emergency services. And more importantly, it's where pilots have been making difficult landings for 70 years without sophisticated automation. As Rodriguez coordinated with Canadian Air Traffic Control, Sarah heard new voices in her earpiece. Captain Elizabeth Morrison had arrived in the operations center, along with Amanda Walsh and several senior Meridian executives. Word of the emergency had spread through the company, and everyone understood that how this crisis was resolved would have profound implications for aviation safety. Hendricks, Morrison said quietly, moving to stand beside Sarah. Tell me what's happening up there. Everything I warned about in my research, Sarah replied without taking her attention off the radio. Cascading automation failure that's invisible to ground monitoring, pilots trained to trust computers over their own experience, and emergency procedures that assume technology is infallible. Flight 447's voice returned. Operations, we're attempting to navigate using basic compass headings and dead reckoning. Our GPS is giving conflicting positions, and the flight management computer is trying to route us to coordinates that don't exist. Sarah leaned into the microphone. Captain, I'm going to give you a heading and altitude that will take you to Gander. Fly it manually and ignore anything your computers suggest as corrections. Standing by for heading. Sarah pulled out her worn paper notepad, the same one that had been mocked during her training, and began calculating navigation manually. Using basic trigonometry, wind estimates, and her knowledge of North Atlantic routing, she plotted a course that would bring Flight 447 to safety without relying on any of the electronic systems that had proven unreliable. Flight 447 turned to proven unreliable. Heading 285 degrees and maintain current altitude, Sarah transmitted. In approximately 90 minutes, you should see the Newfoundland coastline. Heading 285, maintaining level flight, Chun acknowledged. Sarah, how are you calculating this without GPS or automated navigation aids? The same way pilots did it for decades before satellites existed. Paper charts, compass headings, and basic mathematics. Morrison leaned closer to Sarah. You're navigating a commercial airliner across the Atlantic using manual calculation? Dead reckoning, Sarah confirmed. It's not as precise as GPS, but it's more reliable when your computers are compromised. As Flight 447 continued its manually controlled flight toward Newfoundland, Sarah coordinated with Gander International to prepare for an approach unlike anything in modern commercial aviation. The airport's controllers would need to provide constant guidance for an aircraft with unreliable instruments, using procedures that predated computerized landing systems. This is insane, muttered one of the Meridian executives watching the crisis unfold. We're talking about landing a wide-body aircraft without automated approach systems. We're talking about landing an aircraft the way they were landed for 50 years before automation existed, Sarah corrected. The pilots just need to remember how to fly instead of how to manage computers. An hour into the emergency, Flight 447 made visual contact with the Newfoundland coastline, exactly where Sarah's calculations had predicted. The accuracy of her manual navigation sent a murmur of amazement through the operations center. Operations. We have the coast in sight, Chun reported, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Your navigation was spot on. How did you do that without any electronic aids? Because computers aren't magic, Sarah replied. They're just tools that do the same calculations pilots used to do manually. When the tools break, you go back to the fundamentals. But the most challenging part of the emergency was still ahead. Landing at Gander would require Flight 447 to execute a manual approach with unreliable altitude and airspeed indicators, trusting pilot skill over technological assistance. Flight 447, came the voice of Gander Air Traffic Control. We have emergency equipment standing by. Be advised that we can provide radar guidance for your approach, but you'll need to rely on visual references for final landing parameters. Sarah coordinated with the Canadian controllers to establish an approach path that would bring Flight 447 down safely. As she worked, she could hear Captain Chun briefing his passengers about the emergency landing, his voice calm and professional despite the unprecedented nature of their situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making an emergency landing at Gander International Airport due to instrument malfunctions. The aircraft is flying normally, but we'll be conducting a manual approach as a safety precaution. Through the radio, Sarah could hear First Officer Walsh working through manual calculations for approach speeds and landing distances. The crew was adapting to flying without the automated assistance that had defined their entire careers. Sarah, Chun's voice carried both gratitude and amazement. We've been flying manually for over an hour now. And you know what? The aircraft handles beautifully when you're not fighting the computers. It's like learning to fly all over again. Morrison stepped closer to Sarah's station. Hendricks, what you doing here? This is exactly what you were trying to tell us about training philosophy. These pilots are discovering that they can fly without automation. They could always fly, Sarah replied. They just weren't allowed. 2. Every time they trusted their instincts over computers, they were marked down in evaluations. We trained them to doubt themselves. As Flight 447 began its approach to Gander, Sarah found herself thinking about all the pilots whose careers had been derailed for questioning automated systems. Captain Janet Sullivan, who'd been disciplined for saving her aircraft through manual flying. The dozens of experienced aviators who'd been forced out of the industry for trusting experience over technology. Flight 447, you're cleared for visual. Approach runway 13, Gander control transmitted. Contact tower on 118.1 for landing clearance. Sarah listened as Chun acknowledged the clearance and began his final approach. She could hear the concentration in his voice as he flew the aircraft manually, using visual references and basic flying techniques that weren't part of modern training curricula. Operations, Chun transmitted as they passed through 1,000 feet. Approach looks good. Aircraft is responding normally to manual control. It's actually easier to fly without the automation fighting our inputs. The operations center fell silent as everyone listened to Flight 447's final approach. Sarah found herself holding her breath, knowing that the success or failure of this landing would validate or condemn everything she'd been arguing about pilot training. Gander Tower, Flight 447 is on final approach, runway in sight, Chun reported. Flight 447, you are cleared to land runway 13. Emergency equipment is standing by. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the subtle sounds of an aircraft in its final moments before touchdown. She could hear the engines spooling down as Chun reduced power, the whisper of air over the wings as the aircraft descended, and the quiet professionalism of a crew executing a landing that everyone had said was impossible. Touchdown, Chun's voice carried relief and amazement. Gander Tower, Flight 447 is safely on the ground. The operations center erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah opened her eyes to find herself surrounded by people who had witnessed something unprecedented. A commercial airliner saved not by technology, but by the human skills that technology had tried to replace. Rodriguez put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. I've been in aviation for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. You navigated an aircraft across the Atlantic using paper charts and guided them to a safe landing using techniques I thought were obsolete. Morrison's expression was one of profound realization. Sarah, you just proved everything you've been arguing about automation dependency. Those pilots didn't need more sophisticated computers. They needed permission to trust their own abilities. As the immediate crisis subsided, Sarah became aware that she'd been standing at the center of the most public vindication possible. Everyone who had dismissed her concerns about automation dependency had just watched her save 180 lives, using exactly the old-school techniques they'd rejected. Marcus Thompson appeared in the operations center, having rushed over from the training facility when word of the emergency spread. His face showed a mixture of awe and shame as he approached Sarah. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Everything you tried to tell us about manual flying skills and questioning computers. We should have listened. You couldn't have known, Sarah replied. The system taught you that technology was infallible. But technology is only as reliable as the humans who design and maintain it. Flight 447's successful landing had done more than save lives. It had exposed the fundamental flaws in modern aviation training that Sarah had been documenting for months. The aircraft that everyone said was impossible to land manually had been landed safely using techniques that the industry had largely abandoned. As news of the emergency spread, Sarah realized that her exile from pilot training had positioned her perfectly to provide the knowledge that saved Flight 447. Her months in the basement, analyzing incident reports and questioning automation dependency, had prepared her for exactly this moment. The backup's backup had become the primary source of salvation. proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs. But more than personal vindication, Sarah had demonstrated that the aviation industry's rush toward complete automation was creating vulnerabilities that could only be addressed by rediscovering the human skills that made flight possible in the first place. Tomorrow would bring investigations, policy changes, and a fundamental re-examination of how pilots were trained and evaluated. But tonight, 180 passengers were alive because someone had remembered that flying was ultimately about human skill, not computer perfection. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing at Gander, Sarah Hendricks stood in the same Phoenix training facility where her journey had begun. But everything had changed. The sleek glass building still gleamed in the Arizona sun, but the philosophy that governed pilot education within its walls had been revolutionized. The transformation had begun. Within hours of Flight 447's safe landing, as news of the emergency spread through aviation circles worldwide, the industry was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most sophisticated automated systems had failed catastrophically, while basic manual flying skills had saved 180 lives. The Federal Aviation Administration's investigation was swift and comprehensive. The final report, published just 3 months after the incident, contained language that would reshape aviation training globally. The Flight 447 emergency demonstrated critical vulnerabilities in automation-dependent training programs and highlighted the essential nature of fundamental piloting skills that current curricula inadequately address. Sarah's research, which had been scheduled for review by the FAA board, suddenly became the cornerstone of emergency regulatory changes. The data she'd compiled in basement obscurity was now cited in international aviation safety bulletins and regulatory documents from every major aviation authority. Welcome to the Integrated Aviation Skills Program, Captain Elizabeth Morrison announced to a new class of pilot candidates assembled in the main briefing room. This facility now operates under a fundamentally different philosophy than the one many of you may have heard about. Sarah watched from the back of the room as Morrison addressed the trainees. Among them sat Marcus Thompson, who had voluntarily repeated the entire certification program under the new curriculum. His humility and determination to learn manual flying skills had made him one of the program's most dedicated students. Your training will focus on adaptive piloting, Morrison continued, which means developing the judgment to know when to trust automation and when to take manual control. You will learn to fly aircraft as pilots first and system managers second. The changes were visible everywhere. The wall that had once proclaimed first shot, fast shot, last shot now displayed a different message. Understand, adapt, control. Simulator training that had emphasized speed and procedure. Compliance now stressed decision-making under uncertainty and manual flying proficiency. Sarah's new office was on the top floor of the facility, with windows overlooking the training hangars where student pilots practiced manual approaches and emergency procedures. Her title, Director of Adaptive Flight Training, reflected her role in designing the new curriculum that balanced technological capability with fundamental piloting skills. How are the new students adapting to the manual flying requirements? Amanda Walsh asked during their weekly safety review meeting. Walsh had been promoted to Deputy Director of Flight Safety following her role in supporting Sarah's research during the critical months before Flight 447. Better than expected, Sarah replied, reviewing performance data from the latest class. When you teach pilots that automation is a tool rather than a crutch, they develop confidence in their own abilities. Their emergency response times are faster, their decision-making is more flexible, and most importantly, they understand when to question what computers tell them. The changes weren't limited to Meridian Airways. Airlines worldwide had begun implementing similar programs after the Flight 447 Incident exposed automation dependency as an industry-wide vulnerability. The European Aviation Safety Agency had mandated manual flying proficiency requirements, while Asian carriers were completely restructuring their training programs. "There's someone here to see you," Walsh said, gesturing toward the conference room where a familiar figure waited. Captain David Chun, the pilot who had safely landed Flight 447, stood as Sarah entered. His appearance had changed in the months. Since the emergency, he seemed more confident, more grounded, as if the experience of manually flying across the Atlantic had fundamentally altered his relationship with aviation. "Sarah," Chun said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I wanted to thank you personally before I start my new assignment." "New assignment?" Chun smiled. "I've been selected to head the emergency response training program for the International Air Transport Association. They want me to develop manual flying curricula for airlines worldwide, based on what we learned from Flight 447. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement. The pilot who had been trained to trust automation, above all else, was now tasked with teaching others to balance technology with human skill. "There's something else," Chun continued. "The passengers from Flight 447 asked me to give you this." He handed Sarah a leather-bound book filled with personal messages from the 180 people whose lives she had helped save. The pages contained letters from families, business travelers, students, and retirees, all expressing gratitude for her role in bringing them safely home. "Dear Sarah," read one message from a passenger named Margaret Foster, "my granddaughter was supposed to meet me in London for her college graduation. Because of your knowledge and courage, I was there to watch her receive her diploma. Thank you for giving me that moment." Another letter, from a businessman named Robert Chang, was more direct. "I've been flying for 30 years and always assumed that technology would keep me safe. Flight 447 taught me that human expertise matters more than any computer. Thank you for proving that experience and wisdom can't be programmed." As Sarah read through the messages, she realized that Flight 447's impact extended far beyond aviation training. The incident had become a symbol of the importance of human knowledge in an increasingly automated world. "The ripple effects keep spreading," Morrison said, joining the conversation. "MIT just announced a new research program studying human automation, interaction in complex systems. The automotive industry is redesigning driver assistance programs based on lessons from Flight 447. Even NASA is reviewing their spacecraft automation protocols." Sarah looked around the conference room, noting the charts and graphs that now covered the walls, showing improved pilot performance metrics from the new training program. Emergency response times were faster, decision-making was more flexible, and most importantly, student pilots were developing the confidence to question automated systems when something felt wrong. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, pulling out an official document. "This came from the International Civil Aviation Organization this morning." Sarah read the letter with growing amazement. The ICAO was establishing a new global standard for pilot training based on the adaptive approach developed at Meridian. Sarah had been invited to chair the international committee responsible for implementing these standards worldwide. "They want you to travel to Montreal next month to address the World Aviation Safety Summit," Morrison continued. "Your presentation will influence pilot training policies for every member nation." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood before an audience of aviation officials, airline executives, and safety experts from around the world. The same research that had been dismissed as outdated thinking was now being treated as revolutionary insight into aviation safety. "The Flight 447 incident taught us that our pursuit of technological perfection had created a dangerous vulnerability," Sarah told the assembly. "We had trained pilots to be so dependent on automation that they couldn't function. When those systems failed, She clicked through slides showing performance data from pilots trained under the new adaptive approach compared to those educated in traditional automation-focused programs. The differences were striking. Newer pilots showed superior performance in every category of emergency response and decision-making. But this isn't about abandoning technology, Sarah continued. It's about remembering that technology serves humans, not the other way around. Pilots need to understand when to trust automation and when to take control themselves. During the question period, a delegate from the European Union asked about resistance to the new training methods from airlines, concerned about cost and complexity. The cost of proper training is insignificant compared to the cost of accidents caused by automation dependency, Sarah replied. Flight 447 could have been a tragedy involving 180 fatalities. Instead, it became a lesson that saved countless future lives. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Captain Janet Sullivan, the pilot whose emergency landing had been one of the first cases in Sarah's research. Sullivan had become something of a legend since Flight 447, as her techniques for manual aircraft control were now studied in training programs worldwide. "I wanted to thank you," Sullivan said quietly. "For 15 years, I was told that my approach to flying was outdated and dangerous. The Flight 447 incident proved that sometimes old-school skills are exactly what modern aviation needs." As Sarah flew back to Phoenix, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from washout to industry leader. Her failure to meet automation-focused training standards had led to discoveries that reshaped aviation safety worldwide. The transformation was visible the moment she returned to the training facility. Student pilots were practicing manual approaches in aircraft with automated systems deliberately disabled. Instructors who had once emphasized speed and procedure compliance now stressed judgment and adaptability. Marcus Thompson approached her as she walked through the main hangar. His confidence had grown dramatically since repeating the program, and his manual flying skills now exceeded those of most veteran pilots. "Instructor Hendricks," he said with a smile that carried genuine respect, "the new students are asking about emergency decision-making scenarios. They want to understand how to think like you did during the Flight 447 crisis." Sarah paused, considering her answer. "Tell them that the most important thing isn't knowing all the answers. It's knowing when to question the questions. Computers can process data, but only humans can understand when that data doesn't make sense." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing applications from pilot candidates around the world who wanted to train under the adaptive program. Airlines were requesting specific training for their crews, and aviation schools were sending instructors to learn the new methods. Her phone rang with a call from Rebecca Chen, David's sister, who had been one of Sarah's most vocal critics during the original training program. "Sarah," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there months earlier, "I owe you an enormous apology. I was so focused on technological solutions that I couldn't see the human element. David told me what you did for Flight 447, and I wanted to ask if you'd consider letting me audit your advanced decision-making course." It was a conversation Sarah never could have imagined during those early days when she'd been dismissed as too old-fashioned for modern aviation. Now the people who had mocked her approach were asking to learn from her. As Sarah looked out her window at the training aircraft practicing night approaches, she saw student pilots learning to balance automation with human judgment. They were developing the skills that would serve them when computers failed, when procedures didn't apply, and when only experience and instinct could guide them safely home. The woman they had called too slow, too old, and too traditional had become the architect of aviation's future. Her research had exposed fundamental flaws in pilot training that could have led to catastrophic accidents. Her guidance had saved Flight 447 and prevented what could have been one of the worst disasters in aviation history. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had proved that, in an age of increasing automation, human expertise remained irreplaceable. The backup's backup showed that sometimes the most important person in the system is the one everyone overlooks. On her desk sat a framed photograph from Flight 447's reunion dinner, showing the crew and passengers who had gathered to celebrate their survival. In the center of the image, Captain Chun held a plaque that read, "To Sarah Hendricks, who proved that the best technology is human knowledge applied with courage and wisdom." The impossible landing had become possible because someone remembered that flying wasn't about managing computers, it was about understanding the delicate relationship between human skill and mechanical capability. And in that understanding lay the foundation for safer skies and better pilots for generations to come. Sarah's journey from rejected candidate to industry leader had shown that sometimes failure is just preparation for a success that nobody saw coming. The woman who couldn't keep up with automated training had become the person who saved automation from itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.